On a quiet evening in a small suburban neighborhood, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow over rows of modest houses and neatly trimmed lawns. It was the kind of place where everyone thought they knew their neighbors, where life moved at a comfortable, predictable pace. But on this particular evening, something was about to shatter the calm, something that would leave a lasting impression on anyone who heard the story. In one of those houses, an elderly woman named Mrs. Louise Jenkins was preparing to take her daily evening walk. At 72, Mrs. Jenkins carried herself with a quiet dignity that spoke of a life filled with both struggles and triumphs. Her deep brown skin bore the soft creases of age, and her kind eyes were a testament to years of wisdom and resilience. Despite her age, she moved with a steady purpose, aided only by a cane and the company of her loyal dog, Max. Max was no ordinary dog. A large, imposing German shepherd with a sleek coat and a piercing gaze, he had been Mrs. Jenkins' companion for the last 5 years. What most people didn't know, what even some of her neighbors were unaware of, was that Max had a past life. Before becoming her protector and friend, he had been a decorated police K-9, trained to take down threats and protect those in need. The pair were well known in the neighborhood, often seen walking the same route. Kids waved at Max from their bikes, and neighbors smiled warmly as they passed. To most, Mrs. Jenkins and Max were just another endearing fixture in their quiet community. But not everyone in the world shared those warm sentiments, and on this night, trouble was lurking in the shadows. As the streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows over the sidewalks, Mrs. Jenkins tightened her coat against the cool breeze and clipped Max's leash to his collar. They set off, the rhythmic tapping of her cane and the soft patting of Max's paws, the only sounds breaking the stillness. For Mrs. Jenkins, these walks were more than a routine. They were her time to reflect, to breathe, to connect with the world beyond her walls. She trusted Max implicitly, and for good reason. He was her guardian, her silent sentinel. But as they rounded a corner near a dimly lit park, Max's ears perked up, and his body stiffened. He stopped abruptly, his eyes narrowing as he stared into the distance. Mrs. Jenkins followed his gaze, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Just the usual darkened pathway and a row of trees swaying gently in the wind. "What is it, boy?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with curiosity. Max didn't respond the way most dogs might, with barking or whining. Instead, he stood perfectly still, his body tense, his gaze fixed. It was the kind of reaction that sent a chill down her spine, though she couldn't quite explain why. Unbeknownst to Mrs. Jenkins, 3 men were watching her from the shadows. They had been lurking in the area for some time, looking for an easy target. When they saw an elderly woman walking alone, they thought they had found one. Their laughter was low and mean, their intentions unmistakably sinister. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly anticipated, was that the easy target they had chosen was anything but defenseless. As Mrs. Jenkins continued her walk, Max stayed alert, his body moving like a coiled spring, ready to act. The men began to follow her, keeping to the darkness, their footsteps muffled by the grass. Mrs. Jenkins, ever perceptive, began to feel the weight of their presence even before she heard them. Her grip on the leash tightened, her pace quickened, and her heart started to pound. "Stay close, Max," she murmured, her voice low but steady. The men, emboldened by what they perceived as her fear, quickened their pace as well. One of them, a tall man wearing a hoodie pulled low over his face, whispered something to the others, and they all laughed quietly, the sound sending a wave of unease through the night air. They were getting closer now, their shadows blending with the darkness around them. They thought they had the upper hand. They thought they were in control. But they hadn't counted on Max. As the men made their move, stepping into the light with smug grins and menacing postures. Max let out a low, guttural growl that stopped them in their tracks. It wasn't the growl of a pet warning someone off their territory. No, this was something deeper, more primal, a sound that made the hair on the back of their necks stand on end. Mrs. Jenkins didn't panic. She didn't scream. Instead, she stood her ground, her hand steady on Max's leash. "You boys might want to think twice about what you're planning," she said, her voice calm but firm. Max lunged forward with a precision that wasn't wild or panicked, but calculated, as though he knew exactly what he was doing. The leash pulled tight as Mrs. Jenkins held it firmly, not letting him go completely, but giving him enough room to stand his ground. His deep, rumbling growl shifted to a bark that echoed down the empty street, startling the men who thought they had the upper hand. They froze in place, caught off guard by the sheer force of Max's presence. The tallest of the three tried to play it cool, though the shake in his voice betrayed him. "It's just a dog," he said again, this time sounding less like he believed his own words. But Max wasn't just a dog, and the men were starting to realize that. His eyes, sharp and focused, never left them, as if he were assessing their every move, calculating every possible threat. Mrs. Jenkins stood still, unshaken, her hand steady on Max's leash. Her calm demeanor didn't come from a place of ignorance or denial, but from the quiet confidence of someone who had faced enough of life's trials to know when to stand tall. "You boys don't know what you're walking into," she said, her voice even, almost conversational. But there was an edge to her tone, a warning they'd be wise to heed. The shortest of the three men, a wiry figure with darting eyes, tried to brush it off with a nervous laugh. "Lady, we don't want any trouble. Just hand over your purse, and we'll be on our way." His words were casual, but his body language betrayed him. He was shifting from foot to foot, glancing at Max like he wasn't sure if the dog was going to stay put or spring into action. Mrs. Jenkins raised an eyebrow, her grip tightening ever so slightly on the leash. "Purse," she repeated, her tone making it clear she wasn't afraid. "Do I look like the kind of woman who walks around carrying cash for the likes of you?" Her words made the tall man bristle. "You think this is funny?" He snapped, his voice louder now, anger creeping in to mask his growing unease. He took a step closer, but that was all Max needed. In an instant, the dog's bark grew fiercer, sharper, and he strained against the leash, as if daring the man to take one more step. The sudden escalation made the men hesitate again, but Mrs. Jenkins didn't move. She didn't flinch or falter. "Max," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The dog immediately stopped barking, though his posture didn't relax. His sharp gaze remained locked on the men, his muscles coiled like a spring. The tallest man glared at Mrs. Jenkins, his frustration mounting. "You can't scare us with some stupid mutt," he spat, but even as he said it, he couldn't bring himself to take another step forward. Mrs. Jenkins let out a small, knowing laugh. It wasn't loud or mocking, but it was enough to make the men exchange uneasy glances. "Stupid mutt," she repeated, her voice carrying a quiet authority. This mutt used to work in law enforcement. Max here spent years taking down people who thought they were untouchable. People just like you. Her words landed like a hammer. The men's bravado began to crumble under the weight of her calm certainty. They hadn't expected this. They had seen an elderly woman, alone and vulnerable, and thought she would be easy prey. Now faced with a dog that seemed ready to leap into action, and a woman who didn't so much as blink in fear, they were beginning to rethink their choices. But fear and pride are a dangerous mix, and the tallest man wasn't ready to back down just yet. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he tried to muster the courage to press forward. "Lady, I don't care who your dog used to be." he said, his voice shaking just enough to betray him. "You're still just an old." Before he could finish the sentence, Max let out a bark so loud and sharp that it cut through the man's words like a blade. He stumbled back, startled, and the other two men instinctively stepped away as well. Max didn't move from Mrs. Jenkins' side, but his message was clear. Take another step, and you'll regret it. For a moment, the street fell silent, save for the soft rustling of the wind in the trees and the faint hum of a distant car engine. The men stood frozen, unsure of what to do next. They were 3 against 1, but something about the situation felt completely out of their control. Mrs. Jenkins broke the silence, her voice calm but firm. "Let me tell you something about Max," she said, her eyes fixed on the tallest man. "He's trained to protect. He knows the difference between a threat and someone who means no harm. Right now, he sees you for exactly what you are." Mrs. Jenkins stood her ground, her grip firm on Max's leash. She didn't flinch, didn't waver, even as the men stared her down. Her heart raced, but her voice remained steady. "I don't know what you're planning," she said evenly, her eyes locking on the tallest man. "But I suggest you think long and hard before taking another step." Max didn't need any further command. His body was rigid, his muscles taut as if every fiber of him was ready to strike. The men exchanged uneasy glances. Their confidence was slipping away, but they weren't ready to give up just yet. One of them, a shorter man with a scruffy beard, tried to regain control of the situation. "It's just an act," he muttered to the others, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow. "She's bluffing." Max responded with another sharp bark, his teeth flashing as he took a step forward. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet night, and it silenced whatever bravado the men were trying to muster. Mrs. Jenkins allowed herself a small, knowing smile. "Max doesn't bluff," she said softly, the weight of her words hanging in the air. But the tallest man wasn't ready to back down. He took a step closer, his hand hovering near his pocket as if considering his next move. "Lady, you don't scare me," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Mrs. Jenkins raised an eyebrow. "I don't have to," she replied calmly, her eyes flicking down to Max. "He does." What the men didn't know, and couldn't have known, was that Max wasn't just any dog. He had spent years on the force, working alongside officers in high-stakes situations. He was trained to recognize danger, to neutralize threats, and to protect without hesitation. He could sense fear, read body language, and act faster than any human could react. And right now, Max was reading every twitch, every shift of weight, every nervous glance these men gave. The man with the scruffy beard shifted uncomfortably. "Simon, let's just go," he muttered under his breath, but the tallest man shot him a glare. "We're not running from some old lady and her dog," he snapped, though his bravado sounded more like desperation now. Max's growl deepened, a low, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate in the air. The scruffy man took a step back, but the third man, a wiry figure with sharp features, suddenly spoke up. "You hear that growl," he said, his voice tight. "That's not a pet. That's a trained dog." The realization hit them like a wave, though the tallest man still tried to push forward. "So what?" he said, forcing a laugh. "He's on a leash. What's she gonna do?" Mrs. Jenkins' grip on Max's leash loosened just slightly, a small gesture, but one that didn't go unnoticed. Max's stance shifted, his body lowering into a position that was unmistakably predatory. The tall man froze, his confidence cracking. "You've already made your first mistake," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice steady and sharp. "Thinking I'm alone." For a moment, the street seemed to hold its breath. The men stood in a loose formation, their postures rigid, their minds clearly racing. They had come here thinking they would find an easy target, an elderly woman who would hand over her purse without a fight. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected asterisk her asterisk. The wiry man took another step back, his instincts kicking in. "Man, let's go," he hissed. "This ain't worth it." But the tallest man, still trying to salvage what was left of his pride, took a step forward instead. "You don't scare me," he said again, though the tremble in his voice betrayed him. Max growled louder, and Mrs. Jenkins' face hardened. "Then you're not as smart as I thought," she said. "Max, stay." The command was firm, and Max didn't move a muscle. But the air around him seemed to crackle with the promise of action, of raw, unrelenting power held back only by her word. Behind the men, a light flickered on in one of the nearby houses. A curtain shifted as a silhouette appeared in the window. The neighborhood wasn't as empty as the men had hoped. Someone was watching. The scruffy man turned his head toward the light and cursed under his breath. "We've got to go," he said, louder this time. "Now." But the tallest man was too far gone, his pride blinding him to the warning signs. He reached into his pocket, his hand emerging with something metallic that glinted faintly under the streetlight. Mrs. Jenkins' eyes narrowed, but she didn't move. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," she said, her tone colder now. Max's growl reached a new intensity, his teeth bared, his focus unwavering. The wiry man grabbed the tallest man's arm, trying to pull him back. "Are you crazy? Look at that dog. He's not normal." The tension was palpable. The moment stretched thin like a rubber band about to snap. Mrs. Jenkins didn't flinch, her faith in Max absolute. She had seen what he could do, knew what he was capable of. These men had no idea what they were up against. Suddenly, the tallest man hesitated. His hand wavered, the item in his grasp still half hidden. Max's bark shattered the silence, sharp and commanding, and the man flinched as if he'd been struck. "Go home," Mrs. Jenkins said, her voice like steel. "While you still can." For a moment, it seemed like they might listen. The wiry man was already retreating, pulling the scruffy one with him. But the tallest man lingered, his pride keeping him rooted in place. He glanced back at his companions, then at Max, then at Mrs. Jenkins. And then, just as the air seemed ready to explode with action, a voice called out from the house behind them. "Hey, what's going on out there?" It was deep and commanding, the kind of voice that demanded attention. The men froze, their heads snapping toward the sound. In the window, the silhouette moved, and the faint click of a phone being dialed could be heard. "Looks like your time's up," Mrs. Jenkins said calmly. "Max heel." Max stepped back, his body still tense, but his growl subsiding just enough to let the men know he wasn't backing down entirely. The tallest man stared at Mrs. Jenkins for a long moment, his face a mixture of anger, fear, and something else, something that looked a lot like defeat. "Let's go," he finally muttered, shoving his hands into his pockets and stalking off into the shadows. The other two followed quickly, casting nervous glances over their shoulders as they disappeared into the night. Mrs. Jenkins watched them go, her posture relaxing slightly, but her hand still steady on Max's leash. She waited until their footsteps faded completely before letting out a slow breath. "Good boy, Max," she said, her voice soft now. She knelt down, running a hand over his head. Max looked up at her, his eyes calm and steady, as if to say, asterisk, I've got you asterisk. But even as the immediate danger passed, Mrs. Jenkins couldn't shake the unease that lingered. Those men might be gone, but she knew this wasn't over. Something about the way the tallest one had looked at her, the way he'd hesitated before leaving, it felt unfinished. And deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. The night carried an uneasy stillness as Mrs. Jenkins and Max walked back toward the house. Her cane tapped against the pavement in a measured rhythm, but her mind was far from calm. The encounter lingered in her thoughts, replaying like a broken record. She had faced trouble before. She wasn't a stranger to standing her ground. But this felt different. Those men weren't just reckless. They were desperate. Desperation had a way of making people dangerous. Max walked close by her side, his ears twitching at the faintest sounds. She knew he sensed it too. The lingering threat, the invisible weight that hung in the air, even after the men had disappeared. She had always trusted Max's instincts, and tonight they told her one thing. This wasn't over. When they reached the front steps, Mrs. Jenkins paused, looking over her shoulder. The street was quiet, but not in the way it usually was. It felt too quiet, like the calm before a storm. Her hand tightened on Max's leash as she scanned the shadows. "Come on, boy," she murmured, guiding him inside. The familiar creak of the front door was a small comfort as they stepped into the house. She locked the door behind them, sliding the heavy bolt into place with a satisfying click. For added measure, she reached for the wooden dowel she kept by the door, securing it against the frame. It was an old habit, one that had served her well over the years. Max trotted ahead, his nails clicking against the hardwood floor as he made his usual rounds, checking each room with the precision of a seasoned guard. Mrs. Jenkins watched him for a moment before heading to the kitchen. She filled his water bowl and set it on the floor, her hands trembling just slightly. She didn't like feeling this way, this sense of unease creeping into her otherwise peaceful life. For years, she had built a routine, a sanctuary where she could feel safe. And now, in the span of one night, that security felt fragile. As Max lapped at his water, she moved to the window, parting the curtains just enough to peer outside. The streetlights cast long shadows over the empty sidewalks, and for a moment, she thought she saw movement near the edge of the park. Her breath caught, and she stared, waiting. But the shadow didn't move again. It was probably nothing, she told herself. Probably. The hours stretched on, and the house seemed too quiet. Even the usual creaks and groans of the old wooden beams felt muted, as if the house itself were holding its breath. Mrs. Jenkins tried to distract herself, settling into her favorite armchair with a book, but the words blurred on the page. Her eyes kept drifting to the window, to the door, to Max, who hadn't moved from his post. When the clock struck midnight, she decided to call it a night. She turned off the lights, leaving only a dim lamp glowing in the corner of the living room. "Time for bed, Max," she said, her voice breaking the silence. Max followed her down the hallway to her bedroom, his steps cautious and deliberate. She left the door open just enough for him to patrol the house, as he often did during the night. As she climbed into bed, her hand brushed against the cold metal of the small whistle she kept on the nightstand. It was a habit she had developed when she first got Max. A single sharp blow, and he would be at her side in seconds. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of the night. Max's footsteps echoed faintly as he moved through the house, his presence a comfort in the darkness. But sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made her heart race. It was nearly 2 in the morning when Max's growl broke the silence. Mrs. Jenkins bolted upright, her heart pounding. She grabbed the whistle instinctively, her fingers trembling as she strained to hear. Max's growl deepened, a low, menacing sound that sent a chill down her spine. He was in the hallway, his body positioned toward the front door. She slid out of bed, her bare feet touching the cool floor. She moved quietly down the hallway, her breath shallow as she tried to make sense of the low growl that rumbled from Max. Her heart raced, adrenaline flooding her veins as she reached the living room. The dog was standing near the door, his body tense and alert, his eyes locked on something outside. He had never been this still, this focused. "What is it, Max?" Mrs. Jenkins whispered, though she wasn't sure why she bothered. He wouldn't answer. Instead, he took a step forward, his gaze never leaving the door. She hesitated, her fingers brushing against the smooth wood of the doorframe as she reached for the lock. The feeling in her gut told her that something was wrong, something was coming, and it wasn't going to be like before. The men, those troublemakers from earlier, might have retreated, but that didn't mean they had given up. No, this was something different. The soft tapping of footsteps from the front porch confirmed her suspicions. It wasn't the heavy, unsteady tread of a man trying to sneak around. It was deliberate. Measured, someone was waiting. Max growled louder, the sound almost a snarl now, and his body quivered with restrained power. Mrs. Jenkins didn't even have to look at him to know what he was thinking. He was ready to act, to protect her, as he always had. But she wasn't sure if just one dog could handle whatever was waiting on the other side of that door. Without thinking, she grabbed the whistle from the nightstand again, clutching it in her trembling hand. One sharp blow would call Max to her side, but she wasn't sure if even he could deal with what was coming. She needed more information. Slowly, cautiously, she approached the door, peering through the peephole. The image that met her eyes made her blood run cold. It wasn't the same men, not even close. This time, standing at the threshold, was a figure she didn't recognize. A tall man, wearing a black jacket, his face partially obscured by a scarf. He was alone, but there was something unnerving about him. His posture, the way he stood perfectly still in the dim light of the porch, made her stomach twist with unease. She could see the faint outline of something in his hand, too, something long and thin. A weapon, or just a tool. Her mind raced, trying to piece together why someone like this would be here, now. She didn't recognize him, but his presence felt ominous, like a shadow hanging just out of reach. He wasn't just some random passerby, that much was certain. The man took a step forward, and Max's growl deepened in response, now full of menace. Mrs. Jenkins held her breath. If the figure on the porch heard it, he didn't react. He stood there, unmoving, his focus squarely on the door. This wasn't right. It wasn't just a random stranger. No, the way he stood, the way he waited, made it clear he was here for a reason. But what reason? And why was he waiting so deliberately, as if he knew she was watching him through the peephole? Her mind flashed back to the earlier encounter with the men, their desperation, their strange hesitation when they realized Max wasn't just a pet. Was this connected? Was this man part of a bigger scheme, a deeper plan that she had unwittingly become part of? Then, just as Mrs. Jenkins was about to back away from the door and rethink her options, the man knocked. The sound was soft at first, almost too quiet to hear over the pounding of her heart. But it grew louder, more insistent, until it echoed through the house. 3 knocks, slow, methodical. Her pulse quickened, and for the first time, she felt a sense of fear that wasn't just about the danger outside. It was the realization that something much darker was unfolding. The stakes had just been raised, and this wasn't some petty robbery or a random attack. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just here to scare her. Max barked sharply, his stance still ready, his eyes locked on the door, as though urging her to make a decision. She could feel the weight of his gaze, the trust he had in her. But now, more than ever, she wasn't sure if she could protect them both. "Who's there?" She called out, her voice strong despite the quiver of fear beneath it. Her hand was still on the door handle, but she didn't move to open it. She couldn't. The figure didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stood perfectly still, like a statue in the darkness, and for a long, unnerving moment, Mrs. Jenkins wondered if he had even heard her. Then finally, his voice came, low and chilling, almost a whisper that seemed to float on the night air. "You don't know who you're messing with." Her blood ran cold at the words. There was no trace of the desperate menace that had marked the earlier encounter. No, this was something colder. This man was different. He wasn't looking for money or an easy fight. He was here for something far more dangerous. Max growled again, more insistent now, as if urging her to get ready for whatever was about to happen. Mrs. Jenkins' mind raced, the pieces starting to fall into place in a way she hadn't expected. She had always trusted her instincts. And right now, those instincts told her one thing. Whatever this man wanted, whatever his purpose was, it was bigger than she could imagine, and much more dangerous than she was prepared for. The door rattled as the man knocked once more. "I know what you've got," he said, his voice low and threatening. "And I'm not leaving without it." Mrs. Jenkins' heart skipped a beat. What asterisk did asterisk he know? What was he talking about? Before she could process the words, the man's hand moved, and she saw something gleaming in the shadows. It wasn't just a threat anymore. This was something personal, something that was going to change everything. And she had no idea how it was all going to end. But one thing was for sure. The storm was about to break, and she was standing right in its path. The silence stretched painfully between them. The man's voice still lingered in the air like an ominous echo, each word hanging heavy with threat. Mrs. Jenkins' fingers tightened around the door handle, her grip firm but her pulse racing. The gleaming object in the man's hand reflected the faint light of the porch, and for a moment she thought it might be a knife, a weapon that would tear through her world in an instant. But Max was ready, his body coiled and taut, and Mrs. Jenkins knew she couldn't back down. "What do you want?" she called out, trying to steady her voice. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, still as a statue, before taking a step closer. The creak of his boots on the porch was the only sound in the night. Max's low growl escalated, his muscles rippling beneath his fur. Mrs. Jenkins could feel his anxiety, his protective instinct burning through him, and it stirred something deep inside her. She wasn't alone in this fight. Not anymore. "I'm not here for a fight," the man finally said, his voice cold and unwavering. "I'm here for the dog." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice trembling. She didn't understand. What did this man want with Max? He took another step forward. "You don't know who you're messing with," he said again, his tone almost mocking now. "You think that dog's just a retired cop. You have no idea what he's capable of. He's more valuable than you could ever understand." The blood drained from her face. Asterisk more valuable than I could ever understand asterisk. The pieces fell into place like a slow, dreadful puzzle. Max had been a police dog, yes, but he was more than just a companion now. He had been involved in some of the most high-risk operations, working alongside officers in undercover assignments. His training, his skill set, those things weren't just left behind when he retired. And now someone wanted him. But why? Her mind raced. There had been rumors, whispers about criminal organizations looking for highly trained dogs, dogs who had served in the force, dogs who knew the ins and outs of dangerous operations. Dogs like Max were valuable commodities, tools in a much larger game. "Max is just a dog," she said, trying to buy time, but her voice faltered. "You won't get him. You'll have to go through me." The man's laugh was dry, humorless. "I'm counting on that." Before she could react, he reached into his jacket, pulling out a sleek black object, a tranquilizer dart gun. The realization hit her in an instant. He wasn't here to talk. He wasn't here to negotiate. He was here to take Max, by force if necessary. Max barked fiercely, charging toward the door, but Mrs. Jenkins was quicker. She grabbed him by the collar, yanking him back just in time as the dart zipped through the air, embedding itself in the doorframe where Max's head had been a moment before. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she wasn't about to give up. Not now, not ever. "I'm not afraid of you," she said, her voice stronger now, her eyes never leaving the man. "If you think you can take him, you'll have to get past me." The man stepped forward, his face twisted in a cruel smile. He lifted the dart gun again, aiming it directly at her. But just as he pulled the trigger, a blur of motion darted past her side. Max. The dog lunged, his body a flash of muscle and fur, knocking the man off balance just as the dart shot past. The man stumbled back, shocked, his gun slipping from his grip. Max's teeth snapped inches from his face, a warning. Max had never lost his bite, not even in retirement. The man fell to the ground, scrambling to regain his footing, but Max wasn't done. He circled the man, his growl growing louder, more terrifying. Mrs. Jenkins didn't hesitate. She rushed to the door, slamming it shut and locking it with all the strength she could muster. The man's desperate shouts could be heard through the thick wood, but they were growing more frantic by the second. "You don't want to mess with us," she called through the door, her heart still pounding, but a surge of satisfaction washing over her. Max was protecting her, just like he had done so many times before. And this time, he wasn't going to stop until the threat was gone. For a long moment, there was silence. Mrs. Jenkins stood in the dark hallway, listening intently. She could hear Max's low growls, the soft thud of paws on the porch, and then nothing. Absolute silence. She waited. Seconds turned into minutes. She could barely breathe, wondering what had happened outside. She didn't dare open the door yet. If the man was still out there, he would have to face Max, and she knew Max wasn't the type to back down from a fight. And then, finally, she heard a thud. A faint sound that could only be described as the man's body hitting the ground. Max's panting followed, soft and steady, the tension finally dissipating. Mrs. Jenkins let out a slow, shaky breath. It was over. She rushed to the window, peering through the blinds to see what had happened. The man was gone. There was no sign of him on the porch, but she could see the faint marks in the dirt where he had been dragged away. Max stood at the edge of the yard, his eyes scanning the area, as if waiting for any sign of movement. Relief washed over her, but just as she was about to turn away, something caught her eye. A small glint of metal by the corner of the porch. Mrs. Jenkins's heart skipped a beat as she recognized what it was. The dart gun, and beside it, a small, folded note. She didn't want to pick it up. She didn't want to know what it said, but her hands moved of their own accord. Slowly, she unfolded the note and read the scrawled message, the words sinking into her like a weight she couldn't shake. "This isn't over. We know where you live." Her breath caught in her throat, her hand shaking as she gripped the note tightly. The relief she had felt moments ago evaporated, replaced by something much darker. Max's ears twitched, and he looked up at her, as if he could feel the shift in her mood. He had protected her, once again, but the game was far from finished. And whoever was out there, whoever had sent that message, wouldn't give up so easily. The storm had only just begun. Mrs. Jenkins turned toward the door, locking it once more. This time, though, she wasn't just locking it to keep people out. She was locking it to keep herself safe from the unknown storm on the horizon. She wasn't ready to face what would come next, but she knew one thing for sure. She wouldn't face it alone. Not as long as Max was by her side. Mrs. Jenkins stared at the note, her mind racing. The words on the paper burned into her thoughts, the warning echoing like a drumbeat in the quiet of the house. Asterisk, this isn't over. "We know where you live, asterisk." She crumpled the paper in her hand, the anxiety creeping back into her chest. She had no idea who they were, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about a retired police dog anymore. It was personal. Max stood beside her, his dark eyes reflecting the same vigilance that had always been there. He had saved her tonight, kept her safe from whatever danger was lurking outside. But now, more than ever, she knew that the storm wasn't over. The men who had come before, the ones who had threatened her, were just a small part of something much bigger. She walked over to the front window, peeking through the blinds once again. The street outside was eerily quiet, but that didn't reassure her. The calm before a storm was always the most dangerous part. Max sat by her side, his body tense, his eyes scanning the street as if he could sense the same unease. The night felt too still, too silent. She had a feeling the man who had knocked on her door wasn't just a random thug. Whoever sent him had resources, and they weren't going to stop until they had what they wanted. And right now, what they wanted was Max. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. She froze, her heart racing, as the sound echoed in the silence. Was it him again? Had he come back for round two? Max's ears perked up, his growl starting low in his throat as he stood beside her. "Stay back," Mrs. Jenkins whispered, her voice shaky as she moved toward the door. Her hand hovered over the door handle, but she hesitated. It was too soon, too quick. No one could be this persistent. The knock came again, but this time it was different. A rhythmic pattern. 3 knocks. It wasn't the same man. She moved to the peephole, squinting into the darkness. A shadow stood on the other side, but this time it wasn't the tall figure from before. This one was smaller, a woman by the look of her silhouette. Mrs. Jenkins' pulse quickened. What now? Another person sent by the same group. Max growled again, louder this time, sensing her growing anxiety. Mrs. Jenkins opened the door just a crack, enough to peek outside. Her eyes widened in surprise. "Mrs. Jenkins," the woman's voice was soft but urgent. "I'm not here to hurt you." Mrs. Jenkins hesitated. "Who are you?" "I'm Agent Evans," the woman said, flashing a badge just enough for Mrs. Jenkins to see. "I'm with the FBI. I'm here about your dog." The words hit Mrs. Jenkins like a jolt. The FBI. What did they want with Max? "I know this seems strange," Agent Evans continued, noticing Mrs. Jenkins' skeptical gaze. "But I've been tracking a criminal network that's been targeting retired police dogs like Max. It's bigger than you realize, and it's not just about stealing dogs. They use them for far worse things, things you don't want to be involved in. I need your help." The words hung in the air, heavy and laden with a sense of urgency. Mrs. Jenkins took a moment to process. The world she thought she knew, the quiet life in her peaceful home with Max, wasn't as simple as she had believed. Her dog wasn't just a companion. He was a key player in something far darker, something that reached into the shadows of the criminal underworld. She stepped back, opening the door fully to let Agent Evans inside. Max eyed the agent warily but didn't growl. He trusted Mrs. Jenkins' judgment, and if she was letting this woman in, then he would too. "What do you need me to do?" Mrs. Jenkins asked, her voice steady now, though the fear had not entirely left her. "I need you to trust me," Agent Evans said, her tone serious. "The men who came to your door weren't just random criminals. They were part of a much larger syndicate. These people, whoever they are, want Max because of his training, his experience. They know he's more than just a dog. He's a weapon. And if we don't stop them, they'll use him for things that could hurt a lot of innocent people." Mrs. Jenkins' mind raced. It made sense now, the way the man had spoken. the way he had seemed to know so much about Max. She wasn't just dealing with a few thieves looking for a quick payday. This was organized. This was serious. "Do you have a plan?" she asked, her voice tight. "I do," Agent Evans replied. "We've been tracking them for a while, but they're good at covering their tracks. The only way we're going to catch them is with Max's help. We need him to track them down, find where they're hiding, and expose everything before it's too late." Mrs. Jenkins glanced at Max. She could see it in his eyes, the understanding. He knew what was at stake, and he would fight to protect her, just like he always had. But now they were facing something much bigger. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting for justice.